All right, g'day. Welcome back to Collectivitis podcast, where we dissect the disease that is collectivism. My name's Pietro. This is Max. How you doing, Max?
Not too bad, Pietro. What's been happening lately?
Well, I'm on school holidays at the moment, which means that I have an itch for educating that I haven't been able to scratch lately. So, poor you, because you're in my vicinity right now. So,
Well, Pietro, I
I'm
haven't been a
going to
student for
unleash
haven't been a
on
student
you.
for 12 years, so I've got an itch that also needs to be scratched. And I need to be learnt a thing or two.
I have an itch for learning. I haven't learned a single thing since I left high school.
I didn't learn anything in high school. I've learned more out of high school.
Fair point. We have done education episodes before. We did a couple last year. So you definitely, unless you ignored everything I said, which is also what my students do. So that's completely understandable. But if you didn't, you would have learned a thing or two back then as well. But are you ready to learn today?
Let's go. Let's go. In one ear, out the other, retain a little bit of information somewhere in the middle. I think that's how it works.
Yeah. That's the latest research. That's what that tells us. The latest studies in teaching. That's exactly the
Ah,
system we go with.
true.
So the topic for today is everything wrong with democracy. We've talked about everything wrong with money before. We've talked about everything wrong with the education system before. Today we're talking everything wrong with democracy. Now, democracy is kind of like this the gold standard almost, if you will, of almost anyone in the political world because they hold it to such high esteem. But there's for libertarians especially that there are a lot of problems with democracy. And hopefully today we can outline what some of those are and why it actually shouldn't be held in such high esteem. In fact, there's probably more to criticize than there is to value when we talk about democracy. And when I say democracy, I'm talking about large scale democracies across countries, states. By states, I mean like Victoria, New South Wales, that sort of thing. The bigger the democracy is, the less just, the more morally reprehensible it becomes. So, big topic today, and we may as well dive straight into it. So, what do you think of when you think of democracy?
Um, it's a bit of a dirty word on that large scale, like you said, isn't it? Because, the more people bang on about democracy, generally the less there is.
What do you mean by
Um,
that?
well, I mean, niche examples. Think about the two of the most corrupt countries in the world, Democratic Republic of North Korea, and let's say the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's
Yeah,
just this, it's just this word that gets thrown around and is used like on these larger scales as like, everything is fair and equal here. As soon as something is stated as democratic, that's it. Like it's, everything else is swept under the carpet. And I think a lot of politicians, especially those in power, try to do that here to some sort of scale, which is why to me it is slightly a dirty word. Like, by definition and everything like that, democracy is beautiful and it's perfect, but it's used as a bit of an escape for doing shit that is not democratic at all, if that makes
yeah.
sense.
I think you've touched on something really important, which is that countries such as North Korea and Congo and many others, there are countless other examples, use the word democracy to legitimize state power.
Hmm.
And
Exactly.
I would actually disagree with you with that actual democracy, like pure democracy, is not all that perfect and just anyway. So let's start with that. This idea that democracy is just and moral, because if when we talk about democracy, we're talking about the political system where the government is decided in a country through popular vote. Now, lots of countries have different ways of doing this. We have a preferential system here, and we have all the different electorates stack up to decide who the prime minister is. The US has a different system, which each of the states is worth a number of points, and one of the two major parties wins the states. There's all sorts of different ways that democracies are held around the world, but broadly, the thing that combines them all is this idea that people vote, and whoever the most people vote for becomes the leader or becomes the government. And democracy doesn't just stop there. It applies to any time people vote for anything. Now, we think of elections as that moment there. But for example, we had the voice referendum, which was a vote, which was democracy in action last year, where the constitution was changed or not changed depending on what the majority of people wanted. Now, it wasn't exactly a majority that they used for the voice, but there was a similar system there where certain criteria needed to be met. So when we talk about democracy that way, the first problem that comes into it is that it is not voluntary. Now, we're not talking about compulsory voting. Compulsory voting is a whole other topic, which we both disagree with. But if you live in, for example, Australia, and there is a vote on whatever it may be, the outcome on that vote is compulsorily applied to you, regardless of which way you voted. So essentially, what happens is that we have, in effect, majority mob rule. You know, the majority, because there are more of them than the minority, have all of their wishes and desires granted, and potentially at the expense of the minority. If the majority says that we want the minority to do this, this, and this, and pay for this, and the minority loses, according to democracy, according to the pure systems of the rules of democracy, the majority gets their way. And so this is incredibly immoral. I mean, if I, in my own personal private life, do or don't want to do a certain thing, but some majority made up of people across this enormous expanse of land, which is Australia, including some bastard all the way in northern Western Australia, votes the other way, somehow my life is impacted or impeded in some way because these people that I don't know, have never met, have nothing to do with, possibly my local area even all agrees with me. So our entire local area, who all think the same way, have laws thrust upon us that we don't agree with, but that impact our lives in very real ways. And this extends to anything from, you know, who's in government, what taxes to pay, what monetary system is implemented by the state, what building, what construction occurs, where money goes, which public sector is propped up, which private sector is regulated. All of these things are decided by the effects of democracy, because the government of the day decides what all of these things are. And so democracy has enormous impacts on our lives. And I don't know, as a libertarian and fairly, you know, economically conservative, right-leaning, there haven't been any economically conservative wins in democracy in my lifetime. Even if the Liberal Party wins, they expand the public sector and increase the debt. And so by virtue of democracy, the exact opposite of my will has been enacted by every single democratic party that's ever been elected. And so, you know, this idea here that democracy is just is very much antithetical to libertarianism and individual rights. Does that all make sense?
It does. It's a good point. It's a large point you made. Not disagreeing with you at all, obviously, but what would be your alternative to that without removing all government?
Let's get to the alternatives at the end. We'll do the alternatives right at the end. So put a pin in that, because let's talk first about everything that's wrong with democracy before we go to.
We just cut to the chase.
Yeah.
Wrap this episode up in 2
minutes. 6 minutes. Nice rapid one. So yeah, this by having democracy and democracy being used to expand the state, it undermines and de-emphasizes individual decisions and individual rights, because it's kind of like you give up your individual rights because for the good of this greater country, which has decided to go in a different direction, you've been outvoted, and therefore you don't get to do the things that you want to do. And anything that you don't like about the law, and there's every single person in Australia, and I would argue the world, there is at least one thing about the law that they don't like, whether it's some stupid regulation, whether it's some tax, whether it's something being prohibited, whether it's something, whatever it may be. Everyone has something that they don't like about the law. Everyone has, at least on one occasion, therefore, had democracy being weaponized against their own life to stop them from doing something that they would individually choose to do. So this idea that democracy is all good and holy is to be discounted. Now, the other thing that you touched on, which is incredibly important, is that the word democracy, or these whether it's a fake democracy such as North Korea, which is completely fake, or whether it's a much more real democracy like us, like there's no question that we are better off than they are in North Korea, because our democratic system, flawed as it is, gives more allowance for individualism and freedom than their one. So
Is
there
there
are
a perfect
states
example somewhere in the world?
of a democracy.
Yeah.
Well, democracy, and so this is kind of the point. Democracy does work far more effectively the more it's scaled down. So the smaller a democracy, the more your voice as an individual actually has some power and some decision-making prowess. Now, like, if you talk about the democracy down to the extreme locality, like your neighborhood, and we're deciding whether, I don't know, whatever it may be, in your neighborhood, which has a realistic impact on you, there a democracy works much more effectively, because you can talk to people to convince them, you can lobby certain people in different ways, you can try and convince, and potentially you don't win anyway. So there is still this idea of mob rule, but certain things do need to be decided uniformly, such as, for example, which side of the road to drive on. You can't simultaneously have both. And the smaller you have your locality and your democracy, the more effectively it works. The biggest problems with democracy is when they are scaled up to a national scale, for example, like with the whole of Australia deciding on who is in charge of the country, and the person in charge of a country might be extremely preferential to one state or the other, or whatever it may be. Democracy, the more it's scaled up, and you don't have any voice, really. Like, there has never been an election in the history of mankind where an individual has been able to sway, an individual voter, I'm not talking about a politician or a lobbyist or whatever, where an individual voter has been able to sway the election by casting their own vote on the ballot. So whether you vote or not, no difference is made whatsoever. And so democracy loses all value in that sense there, or it loses all legitimacy in that sense. But what I was getting to is that in these fake democracies, such as your North Korea and whatnot, they use this idea of democracy to legitimize the state. And they do that here as well, and everywhere else. Like in Australia, for example, everything that the government does has this aura of legitimacy, because because democracy means that everyone was included in this decision-making process. We all decided this thing together, and therefore the state has power over us, ignoring the fact that, you didn't really have a choice in anything much in democracy. You got to choose between what were, in the end, two shit options. But this idea, this aura that there was a decision being made, which you were involved in, kind of makes you complicit to the point where they can say, okay, now you've been involved in democracy, therefore we have a right to negate you this, to give you that, to take your money in this way, to provide this money to this other person in this way. You've given us a mandate to do that because we had this democratic process. None of that is actually genuinely legitimate.
Do you think there could ever be a day where like every single decision was voted on? I mean, obviously you couldn't have people walking into booths day in, day out, but like some sort of online system, if you will trust them, rather than voting in people who we trust to make these decisions for us, who can then change their mind day by day. If there was all right, we want to pass this law, it goes to the public, yay or nay.
Yeah, like a direct democracy. There have been a couple of ideas like this floated in the past. I think there was this party that was based around this app called, I think it was called Flux, where essentially it was their idea was that we should replace democracy with this direct democracy, where every single thing that's ever happening gets voted on. And you can surrender your vote on issues that you don't particularly have an interest in to gain an extra vote in issues that you have an interest in, and this sort of thing. There was a whole system around it, which is like this kind of direct democracy. Still has all the same problems. It's still majority mob rule on each individual case, but yes, there is less opportunity for an overarching state. I think the Australian Democrats, which is a party that used to be quite big in Australia, but which nowadays is very, very small, their idea was that on every issue, they would go to their members and take a vote. So they weren't a party of principles such as the Libertarian Party, where, you know, we have these principles, and if you don't agree with these principles, like these are the principles of liberty and freedom, go find somewhere else. The party is voting along principles, which is, I think, a much better way and much more consistent way of running a party. They would vote on each individual case by case basis, which meant that the makeup of the party determined what the party actually stood for on any given day. So that's another way.
I think the principles of libertarianism or Libertarian Party are a lot more like, you know, freedom based anyway, because that allows the individual to do what they want to do. Whereas other parties, if they were voting on their own principles, it would still be like quite overarching on the individual.
Exactly. And I mean, the idea of libertarianism is whether you have accepted it into your heart that libertarianism is the most liberty-conducing philosophy or not, it doesn't matter, because it is the most liberty-conducing philosophy. Whether you've accepted that and understood that yet is irrelevant, because you either have or you're wrong. That's kind of the underlying idea behind libertarianism.
Just while you were bringing up, like we were talking about, like the tarnishing of the word democracy, that there's another example is parties using the word Democrat in their name. That's another really good example of that word being sort of slurred.
That's right. And the Libertarian Party used to be called the Liberal Democrats, which I thought was a stupid name. And yes, so all of these allusions to democracy kind of like playing into this idea that, hey, that because this word is so has all this like kind of esteem and value placed behind it by our modern political systems, by alluding to it, we kind of take on some of that value and some of that esteem. So another example of democracy being weaponized is, and this has been done throughout the history of the world, throughout states. Now, you gave two fantastic examples. Another example is the Republic of Florence back in the Renaissance. The Florentine Republic, I think that they're modernly called. They were a republic. You know, Italy was a bunch of different sort of states in separate places, and there was a city-state, which was Florence. In the 1400s, they had the Medici family, who were the de facto rulers of the city of Florence, but because they claimed to be a republic and had a democracy, but they, through the wheels of power and behind the scenes and money and paying and this, they had ensured that no one else could ever win an election. But by pretending to be a democracy, they could always say, hey, look, you know, it's the will of the people. All right, we'll be in charge. We'll take over this. We'll run this place and whatever. But it's the will of the people, though. We're not tyrants. We're not authoritarians. And this always prevented, or for a long time prevented, any sort of uprising or questioning of the legitimacy of their power, because that's what democracy does. It gives legitimacy to what is, in essence, a tyrannical power that tells you what you can't do, and takes your money. If there's a tyrannical power that tells you what you can't do, and takes your money, and you get no say in it, people tend to buck a little bit more. You know, like the idea of the mafia is essentially that. They take a territory, they say, you owe us this money for protection. If you don't, bad things will happen to you. You pay them, and you sort of think, well, fucking mafia, there they go again. But if you were involved in a process where you didn't actually have a say, but they told you that you had a say, and a majority of people voted for their preferred mafia, somehow now it's legitimate, and somehow now it has the authority, the mandate given by the people to take your money and to do whatever it is.
It's kind of hard imagining Anthony Albanese as like a mafia leader, as a mobster.
He is essentially like they are essentially a mob. Like they are.
But you have this image of like really like bad like alpha males that like, you know, would kill you with their bare hands if they need to, and then you've got bloody Mr. Lisp, with his stumbling through bloody any sentence he can.
That is quite comical. And there are obviously certain differences, being that because, you know, this organized system of extracting wealth relies on public relations. You wouldn't have your Tony Soprano being the leader of some party. The Tony Sopranos are behind the scene. The leader of the party generally is some likable or bumbling, in the case of Anthony Albanese, person that seems non-threatening to the average person. That's generally what we have with democracies. And so there are several other problems with democracy and with the outcomes of democracy. As I said before, some democracies are obviously better than others. And you know, the thing is, North Korea is not a democracy. The Florentine Republic was not a democracy. They claim to be democracies, but democracies where there is an actual say do function slightly better. Say what you will, the individual doesn't have any ability to impact a decision, such as with something like Australia. But we still have elections. Like you piss tens of thousands, millions of people off in certain ways, there will be a flip. So this does function better than complete dictatorial authoritarianism. And that's one of the things that we kind of, that is a problem, is that, as you mentioned before, what are the alternatives to democracy? They want you to believe that the alternative to democracy is socialism, authoritarianism, dictators, right? And as we'll get to later, there are other alternatives to democracy. And simply because, so the assumption is kind of democracy may not be perfect, but it's the best system we have by far, and therefore we're going to stick to democracy. And I would argue, in fact, libertarians tend to argue that that is untrue, or at least in the current iteration, democracy is nowhere near the best system that we could have. But there are other problems with democracy. So one thing is that democracy creates extremely perverse incentives. So, for example, to win an election, you as a politician, whoever the politicians may be, need lots of money. Like campaigning, and the amount of money spent on campaigning is what gives parties legitimacy. If you see a party plastered all over the walls everywhere and on every ad on TV and whatnot, you think, hey, these guys are the real deal. Maybe I should consider them and give them the vote. And campaigning is extremely expensive to do on such an enormous mass scale, and it continues to get more expensive as politics becomes more grandiose and more important. And what this creates the opportunity for is for people who want to gain access to the levers of power that democracy provides without being within a political party. They can fund political parties to, either elect their friends or to be friendly with them. And then once the party gets elected, to do them lots of political favors. So this is why, there are big corporations pay lots of money to certain parties to get them elected, or pay lots of money to individuals to get them elected. And then when they're elected, they are preferential towards these corporations. Unions do the exact same thing. There's a reason why the unions are extremely, they all campaign in favor of the Labor Party here in Victoria, is because once the Labor Party gets elected, they pump loads and loads and loads of public money into construction and into all sorts of union-related work, so that they keep their employees working, even if these builds and these things are actually wasteful and not necessary and a waste of taxpayer money. Hey, the unions will help us get elected with the money that we then give them back by funding these projects, which they then send to their members, who pay the wages, who pay the fees to the union, who can then help us win the election. It's this whole turntable of perverse interests getting people elected, and then preferential treatment being given once the party is in power. Lobbyists do the exact same thing. Enormous lobbyists, big pharma, and all of that sort of stuff is all stuff that's extremely tied into helping governments run and helping people get elected. So it creates these perverse incentives. Now, politicians want to get elected, so they accept the funding from the biggest donor, and money talks in every single example. Anyway, that's the whole basis of the free market, is that money is this is the best way of communicating what you like and what you don't like, is how you spend your money. But when you tie the market, or money rather, directly with the levers of power, where you can use this money to get yourself an authoritarian who will say, put in a regulation that completely undermines your competitors and gives you a free run at the market. That's not the free market. This is crony capitalism, and that's exactly the system that we have today. And democracy is the thing that allows it to happen, because you can corner the market by using the authority that democracy provides to the government to crush the competitors out of the market. And that's why we have these mega corporations and these monopolies that are unnatural monopolies created through regulation and through lobbying. Another huge point. So I'll let you ask some questions at this point if you have any.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just trying to think of alternatives in my head to that. But I don't know what there is without saying you can't campaign at all, or you can't not take donations. You can't run a political party without money. And if you did somehow make that a rule, well, one, we don't like rules. Two, you would end up with like money just being given like real basic corruption, like money person to person to make decisions, rather than like, that money going into a campaign and then yeah, I'm just trying to think about that. I did yeah, it's a
Yeah,
big
well,
point.
so I mean, as libertarians, like for example, being involved with the Libertarian Party, what we are essentially trying, like we acknowledge that democracy is imperfect and actually not preferable, and we acknowledge that the state is not desirable either at all or in the state that it is, and we want to minimize it. We're essentially doing something counterintuitive by engaging with democracy and
Yeah.
trying to get into parliament to try and minimize the power and the impact that it has and
Yeah,
the influence
you've
that
got
it
to
has.
play the
So
game to be able to
that is
get there.
essentially what all
Yeah.
libertarian parties do is they counterintuitively try to get access to the levers of power to then minimize the power that these levers of power have. So it is kind of a difficult concept to sometimes get our head around. And so we may as well jump here to the alternatives to democracy. I'll go back and talk about some of the other problems with democracy. But since you really
We're
want to
talking
ask this
about
question,
we're talking
I'll
about
just move to
dismantling a whole system here from the inside.
yeah, well, that's kind of what we're doing. So there's two sort of alternatives. So there's like the full anarchist. So libertarians tend to fall either into like anarchist, anarcho-capitalist libertarians or minarchist libertarians. Now, the anarcho-capitalist libertarian removes all would remove all of the powers of the state and replace it with a strict adherence to property rights and individual rights and negative rights. And you can infer lots of the other rights from property rights, because if you consider that your person is part of your property, anything to do with your person, such as impeding on your liberty or taking your life, is also an extension of property rights. So the anarcho-capitalist kind of concludes that we replace democracy with this democracy of one. So anything that is relating to your private property is a democracy of one that is decided by you alone. So you alone have the decision-making power on anything that is yours, including your person, including your money, including your land, including your house, including whatever. But you have no power whatsoever over anything belonging to anyone else. Now, this is on its surface already a much more moral system, because you don't have the right to anyone else's money. You don't have the right to cast a vote on how their money needs to be spent the way we do currently through taxes. And what we'd have instead is this democracy being created, democracy in inverted commas, where essentially you vote for everything that you would like to have through how you spend your money. And this idea that you vote through your wallet. Hey, there's a new business propped up here and a new business that propped up there. Which business works better? Everyone gets to cast a vote through where they spend the money or where they choose not to spend their money. This
And
something
the businesses
that
that are failing are forced to adapt to try and make more money. And
or
if they
close or
don't, they
whatever.
fail. Yeah.
Exactly. Anything that the public sector provides, education, whatever it may be, healthcare, is then instead provided by private individuals, and where you spend your money determines which one of these services flourishes and which one of these services doesn't flourish and maybe has to adapt. And what you would have is not just two of everything, you'd have lots and lots and lots of different competing markets. And so essentially everything that public sector provides is replaced with the private sector, and you vote in the same way for what you would like and what you wouldn't like with your wallet. And in the same way, you kind of have what would end up happening is that right now, you live in, even if you live in a city or in a suburb where you have an outlying opinion and you disagree with the people around you, you're kind of stuck by virtue of the fact that we have these overarching rules, regardless, that dictate how you can live your life. What you would have in this system where private property is the determining factor of what rules govern a system is that you could, by selecting where you buy property and where you move and where you live in a community where everyone aligns with you, or more or less everyone aligns with you. And by moving there, the de facto rules, by virtue of the fact that everyone in their own private property has the right to determine how things exist there, would align with what you believe should happen. So let's say you are more sort of left-leaning in terms of economics, and you think, no, I think it's better if we collectivize the building of roads. Okay, you go live in a community which agrees with you and believes there, and they decide to pool a certain amount of the resources if you live in that area, and you are voluntarily agreeing to pool a certain amount of your resources to construct the roads.
Yeah,
And
which is
then
fine.
and that's how that would happen, and that
Yeah.
is perfectly coherent with
Yeah.
an anarcho-capitalist system. If you would prefer, absolutely not, I don't want that. Let's privatize all the roads. You go move somewhere else in an area that agrees and believes the way that you believe. And in that locale, maybe there are 2 or 3 competing companies that build different roads and have different sort of fees to use their roads per year. And maybe that's how you run the roads. And the roads is just one example, but I know that people who are critical of anarcho-capitalism always ask the roads
Who's going to
example.
build the roads?
I thought I'd give 2 examples of how that would be provided by without democracy. And again, if you go to this commune and the people there decide that they want to vote on something, again, that if you are voluntarily agreeing to enter into this agreement where, hey, if I go there, I can vote on this, but I might be outvoted and I might not get the thing that I want, but I'm still voluntarily engaging in this voting system, then the democracy there is completely legitimate.
I suppose it's
democracy where you are compulsorily forced into it and the rule is applied on you, whether you want to or not, and you have no alternative. That is what is illegitimate.
That point's really sort of like proving that, a smaller community or smaller an area or a smaller democratic region, for example, like the more truthfully democratic it is or can be, like, as soon as you start having, a country of 26 million people being like voted for together, and on a much smaller scale, as an example, like living in a house, me, for an example, with one housemate, there's 2 of us. We both do whatever we want, we've got like power to do whatever within this house and we don't clash. And probably let's look back like a few hundred years, it's probably why over history as humans have evolved and adapted, there's been little tribes rather than like, big grand scale countries is only a thing of the last couple 100 years. Before that, for thousands of years, there were small tribes making their own decisions in much smaller groups.
Yeah, let's use your house example because that's a good one. Again, so let's say you had 3 people living in your house rather than 2. Okay, and so you'd vote. Do we want the TV in the kitchen or do we want the TV in the living room? Because you have one TV and you have 2 different locations where you might put it, and you vote for whatever it is that you want. And whoever gets voted down, let's say you get voted down because you wanted your TV in the kitchen because you're a weirdo, and they voted TV in the living room. You then, you either accept that you were voluntarily engaged in this democratization of a decision and accept, okay, whatever, everyone wants the TV in the living room, or because you are voluntarily there by your own choice, you go move somewhere else.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is the crux of how kind of democracy can be applied within an anarcho-capitalist system.
I'll go find 2 other people who love the TV in the kitchen.
Exactly. You go live with people who want
weirdos.
the TV in the kitchen. Exactly. Now, what was that? Sorry?
I said weirdos.
2 other weirdos. Yeah.
No, the weirdos are the ones that don't want the TV in the kitchen.
You're really committing to this role.
Thank you.
So the other alternative is minarchist libertarians. Minarchist libertarians who are libertarians who believe in kind of the night watchman state, that the government should be extremely stripped down and should control the courts, the enforcement of the law, so like police and just other small, really the minimalist bare minimum that they can't envision the private sector providing, but everything else the private sector provides. And in this case, the libertarian solution to the failings of democracy is decentralization. In that same sense, there is minimizing the amount of people who are involved in this democracy to the smallest number that is physical, realistic, whilst still having this minarchist government. So maybe you have this idea of free cities where individual cities secede from the rest of the country officially. The laws of the rest of the country don't apply to this city. This city decides their own laws. And then it's a much more localized idea of democracy. So things that would normally piss off everyone in that city because the country has a different law, that city now gets to decide for itself. This idea of free cities is explored by Hopper in this speech that he gave called, Hans Hermann Hopper, in the speech that he gave called What Must Be Done. Also the idea of encouraging secession, encouraging decentralization on any level. So, the secession of any state or any area from the country in terms of what the laws that are overarching them are and deciding their own laws. These are the decentralization moves that a minarchist libertarian would vouch for to remove a lot of the problems with democracy. But we did jump ahead because you were really keen on this alternatives question. So I jumped ahead and gave you some alternatives before your head popped. But let's talk some more about how shit democracy is and some other problems with democracy. So one of the problems with democracy that we haven't even discussed. Now, we've discussed plenty of problems, so I hope you're already on board with democracy being shit. But another problem that democracy has is that it doesn't create an incentive for future prosperity or long-term prosperity. So because the way the democratic system works, every 4 years or every 3 years or every 5 years, depending on where you are and what country you're in, the reins of power could swap hands because the people could vote for someone else and put them in. Politicians are incentivized to spend as much as they can, give as much money to their friends as they can, enrich themselves as much as they can, gain as much political power and social kind of what's the word, like social prowess, gain themselves lots of favors that are owed to them, and do as much social climbing as they can while they're in the really condensed period while they're at the reins of power, and keep that going for as long as they can, because at some point they'll get flipped over and then they'll lose all of that. So a lot of the spending is very short-term spending. Grease the palms of the unions now, construct heaps now, massively increase the welfare state so that I might get voted in again by people who think that otherwise they'd have to be poor and destitute. And this short-term spending is far worse. It's increasing the public debt. It's causing the economy to become inflationary as it has become now. But because it's all short-sighted, it's all people who made these decisions over a long period of time, but in short increments. So they made the short-sighted decision here, the short-sighted decision here, the short-sighted decision here, and a series of short-sighted decisions are just kicking the can down the road for what will eventually be worse.
Well, a lot of the time, like the way they fob it off is that it's like, oh, like, we really need to spend the first 3 years, making sure we're in power for the following 3 years because it's going to take 6 years to do this. And they spend the first 3 years there, like kicking the can down the road, bloody working with lobbyists. And then the next 3 years, it's the exact same thing. They haven't taken that 6 years. It's just 3 years after 3 years. We need another 3 years. We better stay in power. I mean, like, nobody wants to lose the power, but that's their incentive. That's their goal, isn't to make change, leave a legacy of great political decisions. It's let's see how long we can stay in power for. That's our legacy.
Exactly. And so traditionally, the way it kind of worked would be, and this is prior to quantitative easing and the central banks being used in an extremely exploitative way as they are now, and just increasing the public debt into infinity. But traditionally, it would be, the economically conservative party would fix the economy for 3 years when the economy got really bad, and then once the economy was kind of stable, the left-wing progressive economically left party would promise a whole bunch of free things and get elected because people want free things and ruin the economy again. And you'd kind of ebb and flow between the conservative fixing things and the progressive ruining things. But that's not even true anymore, because with the advent of the ability to print money from nothing and not increase taxes and just continuously kick the can down the road in terms of the debt and in terms of inflation, both the right and the left have become what the left wing does, have both become, increase spending, increase the public sector. You don't need to raise taxes, but we cause inflation, and we use quantitative easing to print money, and the government is in, trillions of debt. And we just kick the can down the road, and the next government might be the one. Like, hopefully it doesn't blow up in our face in these 3 years. And, hopefully we're in for the next 3 years, and hopefully it all blows up in the face of the other party when they're in government. But it doesn't matter. I'm just going to keep going till it blows up, and we'll see. We'll just see. I'll get as rich as I can while I can before it all blows up. And both sides do this
that's
now.
Really another issue with democracy, at least here in Australia. I'm sure many other places around the world, is it's this system is set up again for keeping power, but it's set up to make the other side fuck it up. It's like, instead of two sides of the coin working together to do what's best for the people, they spend 90% of their time setting the other team up for failure.
Exactly. And there's so Hopper who does talk about this. He uses the example. So monarchies, where a king or a feudal lord or whatever is in charge of a territory. Obviously, there's problems with that. Obviously, that's not morally justifiable. That some guy says that he is the descendant of God, and therefore he has a right to govern this land, and he uses force, and he still uses force to make sure that people pay him, whatever the tax may be or whatever. But at least a monarchy, at least a king, has more of an incentive to view in the long-term prosperity of his country, because the king not only has his whole lifetime, or queen, not only has their whole lifetime to try and stay in power and to try to keep the country going and try to keep the people happy so that they don't revolt, but they're going to eventually pass the kingdom on to their child. So they have every incentive to not leave their own child to reap the disaster that they've sown throughout their whole reign. So they try to manage things in a way that is long-term and sustainable. It's still not just, it's still not moral, but it is better than democracy, because democracy is leaving it to some stranger they don't know and possibly they hate, possibly someone from the other side that they think is horrible. So they've got, a billion times less incentive to try and look for the long-term prosperity and long-term sustainable future. They have every incentive to try and extract as much wealth and power and esteem as they can in the moment, and all hell to everything else. Does that all make sense? So that's Hans Hermann Hoppe is also elaborates on that quite a bit in Democracy, the God.
That does make sense. I've never really put too much thought into, like, I've never really had such a strong view on a monarchy before. I've never looked at it with that incentive of like leaving it for, your offspring. I've always looked at it more so as like just an individual ruling, which
exactly, like that is not good about a monarchy. But I'm saying,
as an
democracy is so bad, like that even aspects of monarchy are preferable to democracy in that sense there. So that's I mean, that's most of the points that I kind of wanted to cover. There's a couple more I can go into, but what are there any burning questions you have here, or things that I might have skimmed over, or things that aren't completely clear? I'll give you a chance to ask first.
No, I will get you to repeat the name of Hopper and that speech though, because I think that's something that I, and I'm sure many other of our listeners, would love to listen to.
Yeah, so it's called What Must Be Done. His name is Hans Hermann Hoppe, Hoppe. And you don't have to listen to the speech. There's if you just look that up, there's the PDF version of the speech is available all over the place, provided by libertarians. I think the Mises Institute is what provides that. So yeah, that's valuable. And Hopper also wrote the book Democracy, the God That Failed, which explores a lot of these ideas.
Okay.
So just before we finish, one other quick problem that democracy has is that it's often used by like terrorists and warmongers to justify doing evil things somewhere. So for example, Bin Laden, when he attacked America, in his letter, which resurged in popularity a couple of months ago for some reason, everyone started reading it. He blamed, America. The reason for 9/11 was he claimed that, because Americans were over there and committing, and all the American bases in the Middle East and whatnot, and all the harm that America was doing across the world, he was justified in reacting. And because the people of America had voted for the government that had agreed to do this, he was okay with killing innocents because the innocents weren't all that innocent. They were guilty by association because they'd taken part in the democracy that had voted this person in. So, they've
taken part in a democracy that they have no say in whether they have to participate or not.
Well, that's right. But, because you voted this guy in, you are complicit in the things he does. And if we think of democracy the way the state wants us to think of democracy, which is that democracy legitimizes the person in power, that connection is a reasonable connection for him to make. He's saying, well, we're all saying that democracy is people choosing who governs them. The people that govern do horrible things. Therefore, the people are also complicit. In the way that we're told to think of democracy, that is logical sequencing. But it's not logical at all when we think about the fact that the people had choices between two evil people who were running. Maybe both of them would have done the evil thing anyway, in which case the people had no choice on how to not do the evil thing. And millions upon millions of people didn't vote for the person who did the evil thing anyway. They were just,
and
there was
maybe
just
there
a
was
majority on the
maybe
other
there was a
side.
third option who wouldn't have done an evil thing, and maybe the World Trade Center was full of all these people who were voting for the third option. That
Yeah,
like
that's right. So
yeah,
there's, the democracy, the fact that there is democracy, and we say that democracy is people empowering governments, allows for terrorists to make these sort of arguments, and not just terrorists, but warmongers. Because, for example, Israel, at the moment, what they're doing in Gaza, and a lot of the justification for why they have no problem killing innocents to get to Hamas, is this argument here that is, well, these people voted for Hamas. You don't understand. Like, there's no solution to this because these people voted for Hamas. They're getting what they voted for now. But
these people don't actually get a say who they're voting for.
We don't know how many of them, did
Yeah.
each individual person there vote for Hamas?
Yeah.
Most of them are too young to even have voted at the last time they had an election, which was like 16 years ago. So that's not legitimate. 2, how many options did they really have? We don't know.
Yeah.
I'm sure that the democratic elections there aren't even all that, democratic or easily
it's an even lesser level of democracy.
Yeah, exactly. But because we have this view of democracy, it's like, well, hey, this is, you guys voted for this. This is your fault. That's why we get to bomb you now. No. You don't. And they didn't even necessarily get to. It's, again, completely collectivizing a decision and completely removing the autonomy of the individual, which is the antithesis of what libertarianism should stand for.
You said it, Pietro.
I said it.
You said it.
Collectivitis, dissecting the disease that is collectivism. Democracy is collectivism. So that's a little shout out to our name.
Our new name is going to be Democratitis.
Democratitis. That's a good one. I've ranted a lot this episode. The time flew by. It's amazing how time flies by when I'm ranting. So we'd better wrap it up there. Have you got any last thoughts on democracy before we wrap up, Max?
Nope. Just without having solutions. Tomorrow, I don't know. Gets a bit dark, Pietro. Gets a bit dark.
Solution is vote libertarian. That's the
exactly.
Solution.
Maybe in our lifetime we can do an Argentina.
That's an actual. I mean, democracy sucks, but that's an actual move you can make towards
like we said, you've got to play the game.
Harm.
You've got to play the game.
Exactly. So
you don't play the game,
we're trying to get into power, so libertarians are diligently plotting to take over the world so they can leave you alone.
Yeah, like trying to get in power so we can fire ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. So so we can get rid of it. All right, we'll leave it there for today. If you don't already, you can follow us on Twitter, YouTube, Spotify, Instagram. Leave us a review, leave us a like, leave us a comment. We love hearing from you. Have we gotten anything wrong about democracy in your opinions? Vote on it. Vote on whether we got anything wrong with democracy. Anyway, we'll leave it at that for today. We'll catch you later.
End the Fed.